Yes, Judy has gone out, but maybe some of the rest of you are here. I do thank you so much, you ladies that play the piano, Judy song leading, the choir, because you help us to worship our Lord more readily and more fully. And so thank you, each of you who are involved in those ways. Our text is found in the first 10 verses of the letter to the Hebrew Christians, chapter 5 of that correspondence. So we'll be reading there in just a few moments. Would you pray with me? Father, this communion table certainly focuses on Jesus. He came to bring forgiveness. He came to bring salvation. He came to give hope and purpose. He came to bring unity to your people. He came as the ultimate expression of your love. Thank you for Jesus, the focus of the communion moment. May he be the focus of these words, O God. Indeed, may he, Jesus Christ, crucified, buried, risen, be lifted up in these moments. I pray in his name. Amen. Have you ever been in the spotlight? Do you enjoy being in the spotlight? Some people enjoy being in the spotlight. Others avoid it at every opportunity. Sometimes the spotlight can be an ominous place to be. If you go down Highway 69 south inside the eastern edge of Oklahoma, you go on south and you go through McAllister, and I suppose most everybody knows there's a maximum security prison in McAllister. The facility's not along Highway 69. You really don't see anything of the McAllister prison. But if you go on further south on 69, you go through Stringtown, Oklahoma. There is a state prison at Stringtown. And on the west side of the road, as you're going down Highway 69, you see pretty much all of that facility. Prominent structures in that prison facility at Stringtown are guard towers, strategically placed all the way around the entire prison complex. And sitting atop those guard towers are lights. It's probably not a real desirable place to be in the spotlight of one of those lights. On the other hand, the spotlight can be a delightful place to be. 2 Sundays from today, as the young people have an integral part in our worship time. They will be in the spotlight, and that will be a joy and a delight. Being in the spotlight, it literally means that attention is focused on that one or that situation that is in the spotlight. And our text shines the spotlight, as it were, on two different individuals, on two different persons. We'll try to look at each of those two persons in these few minutes. Hebrews chapter 5, beginning with verse 1, and we see God shining that spotlight, as it were. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. The first of the spotlights is shown on Aaron. He was the first high priest of the nation of Israel. He was the older brother of Moses, as you probably know. And he was chosen, pointed out, designated by God as their first high priest. The writer points the spotlight on Aaron in three particular characteristics, if you will, in three particular realities. The first of these is that he is appointed by God to offer gifts and sacrifices. He is appointed to serve, if you will, as the people's representative to God. When the people would, according to the law of Moses, would offer sacrifices, maybe the lamb, maybe the goat, maybe the bull, maybe the heifer, whatever it might be, when they would offer the grain offering that God designated through his law, it would be Aaron who would officiate and who would actually do the offering on behalf of the individual. But Aaron wouldn't just be that one who would handle the offerings. God made provision for His people just because of their love for Him to offer special gifts in addition to the required sacrifices. Maybe those gifts would be produce off of the fruit trees, or out of the garden, or out of the field, or out of the kitchen, whatever it might be. Aaron was the one who was designated by God. Not just everybody could go to God, but Aaron, you can. You can bring their gifts and their sacrifices. You can be their representative before me, was what God said. But there was a second characteristic about Aaron, and that is this. The writer says he was subject to weakness, just like every other person of the nation. What the writer means is Aaron had sinned just like all the rest of the people had sinned. At times, Aaron's sin was glaring. Moses up on the mountain, Mount Sinai, for 40 days. The people begin to get restless. They say, "Where is this Moses? We don't know what's happened to him. Aaron, you make for us gods who will go before us. Gods we can see, gods we can hold on to." And so Aaron, without a word of protest, collects all their gold jewelry, somehow fashions it into a golden calf, and sets it up and says, "This is your God, we'll worship him tomorrow." Aaron's sin was very glaring and evident. On another occasion, Moses, described by God as more meek and humble than any person on the face of the earth. And Moses' older sister and brother, Aaron, and their sister Miriam, they kind of got the idea, hey, what's so great about little brother Moses? We're just as good as he is. And so Aaron and Miriam kind of came up and said, "Moses, who do you think you are? We're just as good as you. God can use us just as much." And before that little ordeal was over, Aaron's sin was pointed out by God, and Miriam spent a week as a leper. Yes, Aaron was very much guilty of weakness and sin. And because he was, the text says, he was absolutely obligated. He was required not just to make sacrifices for your sins, not just to give your gifts to God, but he had to do it for himself too, because he was in the same boat as everybody else. Aaron had very glaring sin, and he couldn't come out from that. He couldn't deny that. And so the writer says, he didn't just offer the gifts and sacrifices for everybody else. In order to come into God's presence, he had to offer them for himself as well. The third thing that the text says characterized Aaron was that he was called, he was designated by God, he was appointed by God. You see, in the Old Testament, it was an attitude of keep your distance from God. You don't just barge in on God, so to speak. Aaron could come to God, but he had to come very cautiously and very carefully. In fact, Aaron was the only one designated to come into God's presence. Aaron's two oldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, they got it in their heads early on. Well, yeah, I know God's chosen Dad to be the high priest, but we can just do a little of this priestly stuff ourselves. We don't have to wait for God to tell us. And before that was over, Nadab and Abihu were struck dead, burned with fire. On another occasion, a relative of Aaron and Moses, a cousin, as it were, by the name of Korah, he got it in his head. Moses, you're just a little too big for your britches. I and my 250 men, we're just as important as you are. We're just as much God's people as you are. Moses fell down on his face and said, pleaded with the Lord, show them, Lord, whom you have chosen. And before that deal was over, Moses and Aaron were vindicated by God as having been called by God. And the earth literally opened up and swallowed to their deaths Korah and all of his followers. Point is, you didn't come without being invited into the presence of God. And the text says that Aaron was called, he was designated by God to come into his very presence. We'll want to keep those three characteristics of Aaron in mind as the spotlight now turns from shining on Aaron to shining on someone else. You see, if there's a theme to the entire letter to the Hebrew Christians, it would be this: Jesus Christ is better. Jesus Christ is superior. Early on, the writer showed how Jesus was superior to the angels. Then he showed how Jesus is superior to Moses. Now he's about to show how Jesus is superior to Aaron as the high priest. And so the spotlight shifts from Aaron, and now the spotlight is on Jesus in verses 5 through 10. The writer says that there are some aspects that Jesus is similar to Aaron. One of those is, like Aaron, Jesus was called by God. Now, while Aaron was called by God when Moses was up on the mountain, Jesus was called and designated by God centuries before. Did you notice? The text highlights two Old Testament Psalms. The first, Psalm 2, God says about Jesus, long before he was ever born of a virgin, says about Jesus, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." What a declaration that is of designation by God. You are my one and only son. But God doesn't just call him and declare him to be son. In Psalm 110, written centuries before Jesus was incarnate, God also says, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Just a brief aside for a moment. Melchizedek, we'll meet him again a little bit later on. Rather mysterious Old Testament character. We'll save comments on Melchizedek for later on. But the point is, you are a priest, and a priest who goes on forever. Jesus, called by God, he didn't presume upon himself. He didn't barge in, as it were. No, like Aaron, he was designated, but in a far more eternal, in a far more powerful way. God says, "You're not just high priest, you're my son, and I declare that." The second similarity, if you will, Aaron was to offer gifts and sacrifices. Jesus was to do that as well. But the writer doesn't really use those words. He uses about Jesus and his gifts and sacrifices, prayers and supplications. You see, when the writer looks at Jesus and his offering of sacrifices, he says, "Come go with me. We need to go to a garden." And that's where he takes us. He takes us to a garden. It's a rather ominous garden. It's the Garden of Gethsemane. And the writer says that they're in that garden as Jesus was offering up. What he offered up was cries and tears. See Jesus on his face, tears streaming down and sweat streaming down. As it were, great drops of blood, Luke says. And those cries and tears were to the one who could save him from death. Hear Jesus say there in the garden, "Father, all things are possible for you. Would you remove this cup from me, this cup of suffering, this cup of sin bearing?" And yet, he would say, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." The writer says he was heard. God heard those prayers and tears, those cries. He was heard because of his reverence. The NIV says because of his reverent submission. There was no pretense in Jesus praying there in the garden. His were not perfunctory prayers. His were not those prayers that said, "Well, I really need to pray, so I think I'll take this time." No. He was praying because he could do nothing else. And he was offering up to God not gifts and sacrifices in the form of animals and grain offerings. He was offering up himself. He was heard because of his reverent submission, as it were. And then the text goes on to say something very, very strange. The text goes on to say that he learned obedience through what he suffered. Do not make the mistake of thinking that indicates, that suggests that he was ever disobedient. Jesus never was. On more than one occasion, he would lay himself open before all of his listeners, even his enemies, and would say, "Can any of you find me guilty of sin?" He was never disobedient. But he was so associating with us as fallen people that he was well aware that many times our obedience will involve our suffering. Maybe it's speaking the name of Jesus and suffering ridicule from the crowd. Maybe it's maintaining your sexual purity when all of your friends are sacrificing theirs, and it will cost you friends. Maybe it's determination to deal honestly with customers, and it will cost you your job. Sometimes obedience can result in suffering, and Jesus so completely identified himself with fallen humanity that the writer says, through his suffering, he associated with us in our suffering that comes as a result of obedience. The writer goes on to say a second thing that's very strange. He says, being made perfect. Does that mean he was ever less than perfect? No. When the Bible speaks of perfect, many times it carries a picture of completeness, of fullness. And what the writer's saying is that Jesus so associated with fallen mankind that he could completely relate to our fallenness, to our suffering in the midst of our fallenness. He could relate totally and completely in that moment. There was nothing that we go through that he wasn't experiencing and dealing with. The writer says, as a result of that suffering, those cries and tears, as a result of the resultant death on the cross, the writer says he became the source of eternal salvation. Every time Aaron offered on that altar gifts and sacrifices, all it did was push sin back. Pushed it back. Let's push it back for another year, and we'll deal with it again. No, Jesus didn't do that. He became the source of eternal forgiveness and salvation there on the cross. I wonder today if we think much about that. We're often caught up in job and paying the bills and getting the kids to ball practice and all of the other things that consume our daily activities. And yet for this writer, eternal salvation was front and center in his thinking. He declares that Jesus, through his suffering, through his complete association with fallen humanity, became the source for eternal salvation, the only source. Peter says in Acts chapter 4, verse 12, salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to men by which we must be saved. This writer would fully agree he is the source for eternal salvation to all those who would call upon him and obey him. Sometimes obedience challenges us. Obedience begins with a commitment of a life to Jesus Christ. It begins with putting one's faith and trust totally in him and repenting of my sin, repenting of your sin. It continues with confessing his name before men and being born of water and the Spirit, being born anew in baptism. But obedience doesn't end there. He became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him in faithfulness. In living a faithful life, Jesus himself would say to an exiled apostle, as a message to send to churches, he who is faithful all the way to death will inherit a crown of life. Obedience calls for faithfulness, but obedience also calls for submission, for reverence, for living a life of total dependence and being utterly sold out to God. None are excluded, for all who obey him. We hear these words, and it seems to me that we have no choice but to ask ourselves. Aaron was in the spotlight as we began. Jesus was in the spotlight as we conclude. You in your life, and I in my life, are shining the spotlight. Who is your spotlight shining on? I dare say it's not shining on Aaron. You see, a spotlight means that person is front and center in my whole being. It won't be Aaron for any of us. But for some of us, our life spotlight is focused on ourselves. I'm front and center in my being. Or maybe that spotlight is focused on a spouse, or a child, or some children. That's the one that's front and center in my being. Maybe that spotlight is focused on a job, or community standing. Or maybe that spotlight right now is focused on the government and Washington and the condition of our country. The writer would urge us, make sure that the spotlight of your life is shining on the right person. Because the truth is that in light of the world in which we live, and we can grumble and complain, we can bemoan the state of the world in which we live, of our nation, or we can do something to bring about changes in that. And a key to how we deal with the troubling situation that we see all around us is, where is the spotlight of my life shining? Where is the spotlight of your life shining? If it is shining on Jesus, and if front and center in your life is that eternal salvation that He offers, that cleansing and forgiveness, then you will have a message of hope and encouragement, as Judy would have said, of revival in this world in which we live. But if your spotlight of your life is focused anyplace else, then you will come up empty. He is the source of eternal salvation for all who would obey Him, who would keep the spotlight of their life, the focal point of their life, not here, not there, not here, but on Him, the source of eternal salvation. I would ask you, where is the spotlight of your life shining? Who is front and center for you? Do you need to make any changes about that? Eternity is very real. If you have not begun that journey of obedience through making Jesus Lord of your life, then eternity will be a very frightening thing to think about. If you've already begun that journey, then is He and the eternal salvation that He offers still in the spotlight of your life? If so, you have a message to share in a world and with a world that desperately needs to hear. Our hymn decision is number 330, Only Trust Him. That's what is involved in the spotlight of our lives shining on Him. It's trusting Him. If you need to change the focus of the spotlight of your life, maybe now would be a good time to do so. Number 330, if God is dealing with you, that you stand.